In 1280, following the conquest of the southern Song dynasty, Kublai Khan turned his ambitions toward the kingdoms beyond the seas. What if the Mongol Yuan Empire's conquest of Southeast Asia had succeeded? The story might have been vastly different if not for the fierce resistance of the Champa kingdom. While the celebrated victories of Dai Viet against the Mongol Yuan forces often take center stage in historical narratives, a lesser-known yet equally pivotal struggle unfolded further south. The kingdom of Champa's fierce resistance against the Mongols became a linchpin in safeguarding Southeast Asia, disrupting Yuan plans to use Champa as a springboard for a southern assault. What made Champa such a critical battleground in the Mongol Yuan's grand strategy for dominance in Southeast Asia? Under the rule of King Indravarman V and Crown Prince Harijit, Champa, a vibrant Hindu-Buddhist polity in present-day central and southern Vietnam, emerged as a key location. Known for its flourishing maritime trade and cultural sophistication, Champa was more than just a regional power. It was a vital link in the intricate web of Southeast Asian kingdoms opposing Mongol expansion. The Chams, its resilient people, were skilled seafarers and warriors, adept at navigating their rugged coastal terrain and dense jungles to repel invaders. Strategically, Champa's location was the linchpin of regional dominance. Nestled between Dai Viet to the north and the Khmer Empire to the west, it commanded the vital maritime trade routes that connected China, South Asia, and the Middle East. From the Yuan dynasty's perspective, gaining control over Champa would unlock immense economic and military advantages. These trade arteries were not only sources of wealth, but also critical for the logistical support of military campaigns. For the Mongols, Champa was more than just a target, it was a gateway. Securing its strategic position would enable them to launch a two-pronged assault on Dai Viet, striking from both the north and the south. Additionally, it would encircle the Khmer Empire and open pathways to the resource-rich trade hubs of Java and the surrounding archipelago. Beyond Southeast Asia, such dominance would set the stage for Yuan expeditions deeper into the Indian Ocean, expanding their reach to new horizons of conquest and commerce. Champa's resistance was not merely a defense of its own sovereignty, but a pivotal act in the broader struggle to preserve Southeast Asia's independence from the Mongol Empire's ambitions. The Yuan's aggression towards Champa was not arbitrary. When Kublai Khan turned his attention to the kingdoms beyond the seas, his demands were clear submission or subjugation. To enforce his dominance, he bestowed the title of Duke of Champa. Upon King Indravarman V, an attempt to integrate Champa into the Yuan sphere of control. Yet Indravarman V refused to bow in person, offering tribute in goods, but withholding the submission of his presence, a calculated stance of defiance. For them, the physical act of kowtowing before a foreign ruler was more than ceremonial, it was an irreversible surrender of sovereignty. In an era dominated by empires, such defiance was a bold assertion of independence, a refusal to let their autonomy be eroded piece by piece. Kublai Khan's envoys were relentless, repeatedly demanding tribute and royal attendance from Champat. Each time, the kingdom stood firm, refusing to set a precedent that might embolden further Yuan incursions. Their defiance was not just about rejecting imperial demands, it was a symbolic stand against becoming pawns in a hegemonic game. As King Indravarman V aged, Crown Prince Harijit emerged as a symbol of strength and defiance. Yuan envoys, sent to enforce submission, were met with resistance and ultimately forced to retreat. Harijit's leadership encapsulated the spirit of a kingdom unwilling to yield, even as the Mongol threat loomed large. Champa's survival was deeply connected to its northern neighbor, Dai Viet. Historically, their relationship was one of rivalry, a cycle of invasions and counterattacks. Dai Viet's armies once captured Champa's king, while Cham forces retaliated by burning Dai Viet's capital, Phang Long. Yet these hostilities were typical of a broader pattern in history, where territorial disputes and power struggles shaped the relationships between neighboring states. The invasion of Champa under Tran Tai Tong was not an act of conquest but a calculated move to secure their southern border in anticipation of Mongol aggression in 1525. This 10-month campaign served as a preemptive measure, allowing Dai Viet to consolidate its strength for the first Mongol invasion of Dai Viet. By 1266, King Indravarman V sought to shift the dynamics of the region. Champa initiated diplomatic efforts with Dai Viet, dispatching 4 missions between 1266 and 1270. These attempts to build an alliance underscored a shared recognition the Mongols posed an existential threat that could only be countered through cooperation. So when the Yuan Empire demanded grain supplies and safe passage for its armies through their territory to invade Champa, the Tran rulers decisively denied the request. They understood that granting passage would not only endanger Champa, but also expose Dai Viet to conquest. By aligning their policies with Champa's resistance, Dai Viet demonstrated a commitment to regional solidarity against a common enemy. For the Yuan Emperor, Champa's resistance was intolerable. Then, in 1281, Kublai Khan ordered a campaign to subjugate Champa. Under the leadership of Sogatu, with generals Lu Shen and Yigmis serving as key strategists, preparations for this invasion demanded immense sacrifices. The southern regions of the Yuan Empire were drained of resources, their people conscripted for forced labor, and their grain stores requisitioned to fuel the expedition. Even Hainan Island was transformed into a logistical hub, where the indigenous Li people were compelled to forge weapons and construct warships for the campaign. In Champa, the storm of war had long been anticipated. King Indravarman V and Crown Prince Harajit constructed a massive wooden fortress with a circumference of 20 miles, fortified with state-of-the-art trebuchets, gravity-powered siege engines that were among the most advanced weapons of the time. Over 10,000 elite soldiers manned these defenses, while the royal residence was strategically positioned 10 miles from the main stronghold, supported by a reserve force. The Champa court raised an army of 20,000 to 30,000 troops, carefully fortifying coastal regions and creating supply depots in the highlands as fallback positions. This foresight ensured that even in defeat, the kingdom could retreat and regroup. Despite their defiance, the coastal kingdom faced an adversary whose resources and power were seemingly insurmountable. Yuan forces, drawn primarily from southern provinces like Fujian, Huguang, and Huaishi, prepared for an overwhelming assault. By late 1282, an army of 100,000 soldiers, including 10,000 professional naval troops, embarked on 1,000 ships from Guangzhou, heading straight for Champa. In early 1283, the Yuan fleet, a formidable armada, entered Krai Banoi Bay, modern-day Quai Nan, Vietnam. Sogatu, the Yuan commander, hoped that this overwhelming display of power would force King Indravarman V and his court into submission. Confident in their superiority, the Yuan forces did not immediately attack. Instead, Sogatu chose a diplomatic approach, sending envoys to negotiate Champa's surrender. Yet, Sogatu's calculations severely underestimated the resolve of Champa's leadership. Over the course of 8 attempts, Yuan envoys were sent to persuade King Indravarman V to surrender. Each time, they were met with staunch rejection, some even meeting a deadly end. Far from yielding, King Indravarman V boldly responded by sending a letter of challenge, making one thing clear: Champa would never bow to foreign domination without a fight. Sogatu made the decision to attack after his strategy of negotiation failed. As the Yuan forces prepared for battle, a fierce storm struck, damaging over half of their fleet while anchored. However, the Yuan army, camped on land, avoided significant losses in personnel or equipment. By the middle of February 1283, the Yuan forces launched a 3-pronged assault under the cover of night, targeting the wooden fortifications of Champa. The Yuan navy focused on the northern gate, while another division struck from the east. Sogatu personally led the main army, dividing it into 3 units to attack the southern side of the city. The timing of the assault during the night rendered Champa's stone-throwing war machines less effective. Yet, even so, the stone projectiles from the Champa's artillery inflicted considerable damage on the Yuan forces. As the battle raged, the Champa defenders opened the southern gates, sending their elite soldiers and over 10,000 troops into the fray. Prince Harajit, commanding his forces, fought valiantly, but despite their efforts, they could not halt the Yuan advance. The clash was fierce, but the Yuan forces pushed forward relentlessly. The battle raged fiercely for more than 6 hours, but by the end of the day, the Champa forces began to falter. Realizing the situation was turning against them, Prince Harajit ordered a retreat toward the northwest. The Yuan forces poured into the city, securing the wooden fortifications and overwhelming the defenders. Champa's laborers and soldiers who were left behind to cover the retreat were mercilessly slaughtered. Prince Harajit's troops regrouped and made their way to the royal residence, where they joined forces with the king. With the situation growing dire, the Champa forces abandoned the royal residence and retreated to their capital Vijaya to avoid being trapped by the Yuan's superior numbers. After capturing the wooden fortifications, Sogatu took a moment to reorganize his forces before marching straight toward the capital, Vijaya. King Indravarman and Prince Harajit had already evacuated their forces and resources to the western highlands. The Yuan army, advancing into the now empty capital of Vijaya, hesitated to garrison the city. Following Mongol custom, Sogatu set up camp outside the city walls, choosing to maintain his forces in the open. To preserve his strength while tightening his grip on Champa, Sogatu was drawn into a ruse of false surrender. King Indravarman sent emissaries to negotiate with the Yuan general, and one of Champa's own officers, Bhadradeva, fearing the overwhelming power of the Yuan, offered to surrender. However, this was no genuine submission, it was a ruse by Champa to buy time. Bhadradeva subtly fed false information to the Mongol forces. He claimed that Champa was in chaos, with many officials eager to submit to Yuan rule. Sogatu, eager to exploit this apparent disarray, believed he could lure more Cham soldiers to surrender by displaying Yuan banners and attire, thus swelling his ranks. On February 21, 1283, Bhadradeva took on the role of negotiator and entered a battle of wits with Sogatu, aiming to delay the inevitable as long as possible. He initially presented gifts to Sogatu, stating, "The king is ill and cannot come, but his eldest son, Harajit, will come in 3 days to present himself." Sogatu, still suspicious, reluctantly accepted the gifts while waiting. On February 27, 1283, Bhadradeva arrived at Sogatu's camp with 2 captives, claiming they were the sons of King Indravarman. He further spun a tale previously, "You faced an army of 100,000, but now all have been defeated. I hear that Harajit is dead, and the king had been struck by an arrow to the cheek, and though his condition had improved, he still felt ashamed and fearful, unwilling to appear before you." Despite his doubts, Sogatu briefly accepted the story but dismissed the captives as being unconvincing and sent them back. On March 15, 1283, Bhadradeva appeared once again with high-ranking officials from Champa, ostensibly to surrender. However, a Chinese defector also came to Sogatu's camp, claiming that Champa's forces were preparing their defenses for an imminent counterattack. The conflicting reports created confusion for Sogatu, who ordered that Chinese defector to confront Bhadradeva. With sharp reasoning and careful manipulation, Bhadradeva convinced Sogatu that Champa's forces were no longer a threat and had lost their fighting spirit. He argued that the Yuan need not send an army to conquer Champa. Instead, he assured Sogatu that the Cham people would surrender without further resistance. As the Champa forces completed their preparations for war, Bhadradeva received orders to return. The king of Champa's strategy of delay had worked smoothly, forcing Sogatu to halt his campaign for nearly a month. During this time, the Champa forces, with vital support from the indigenous hill tribes, constructed a new wooden fortress on Enahao Mountain, fortified with a system of ditches and ramparts along the road. However, the king's authority had waned due to recent defeats along the coastal regions, where they had been forced into a weaker position by the Mongol general. In the plains of Vijaya, many of the Champa nobility, seeing the Mongols' power, defected and pledged allegiance to the Yuan. Sogatu took advantage of these defections, recruited the traitorous nobility, integrating them into the Mongol army to replenish his lost forces. The Champa envoys urgently traveled to Cambodia and Java, seeking to form alliances to resist the Mongol advance. In a show of solidarity, King Tran Han Tong of Dai Viet dispatched 20,000 troops and 500 warships to support Champa. The provinces of Amaravati and Indrapura also sent reinforcements to aid King Indravarman V. Crown Prince Harajit, joined by the hill tribes and various local lords, rallied over 20,000 soldiers. In total, the united force of Vietnam and Champa numbered 40,000, sufficient to defend the western hills and fight a prolonged campaign against the Yuan. Today, when we discuss the retreat of the Champa forces to the highlands, it is hard to imagine the stark difference between a tactical retreat to preserve strength and a shift from open-field warfare in the plains to a war of attrition using mountainous bases. Looking at the outcome of Champa's resistance to the Yuan, it is clear that long-term preparations and close ties between the people of the highlands and the coastal regions played a crucial role. It was these connections between the highland tribes and the coastal dwellers that allowed the Cham rulers to safeguard treasures in times of unrest, often hiding them in the highlands and seeking refuge in the forests when attacked by external forces. When Bhadradeva fled, Sogetu realized he had been deceived. Wasting no time, he ordered an immediate attack. In March 1283, Sogetu launched a two-pronged offensive against the Champa stronghold. One force advanced by land through the mountains, while Sogetu led hundreds of warships upriver toward the highlands. The Mongol forces pressed toward the newly built wooden fortress of the Champa. However, the perilous terrain proved a formidable ally for the defenders. Champa warriors fiercely resisted from all directions, employing a mix of ingenious tactics. From high slopes, they unleashed avalanches of obstacles upon the advancing enemy, while hidden ambush units attacked the Mongol forces from both flanks and their rear. The result was catastrophic. The Mongol army suffered a crushing defeat. Both wings of the invading forces were forced into retreat, with the land contingent enduring particularly heavy losses. Bloodied and battered, the surviving Mongols barely managed to escape to their camp through makeshift escape routes. With their efforts to seize the Champa stronghold ending in failure and heavy casualties, Sogetu was compelled to rethink his strategy. The Mongol forces withdrew from Vijaya to the coastal region of Quainan, where they constructed a new wooden fort as a base for long-term operations. Sogetu began stockpiling supplies by raiding the surrounding areas and divided his forces for defensive measures while anxiously awaiting reinforcements from the Yuan court. Riding the wave of their earlier successes, King Indravarman V ordered his forces to descend from the mountains and strike the weakened Mongols in the lowlands. In a bold move, Crown Prince Harajit led his troops to attack the wooden fortress, aiming for a decisive victory. Yet, as the Champa warriors left the familiar terrain of the highlands for the coastal plains, the tide shifted. The Mongols, skilled in open-field warfare, turned the tables in a ferocious battle. Despite heavy losses on both sides, Harajit's forces were unable to break the Mongol defense. Forced to retreat, the Crown Prince ordered his troops back to the mountains, where they could rely on their natural advantages. Though Sogetu claimed victory in the plains, it came at a steep cost. His troops suffered heavy casualties, leaving him with no choice but to fortify his position within the wooden fortress and await reinforcements from the Yuan dynasty. As he sent urgent letters for help, his forces resorted to widespread looting to sustain themselves. Yet the signs of strain were clear. The Mongol campaign in Champa was beginning to falter. Recognizing their disadvantages in open combat, the Champa court shifted to a strategy of attrition. They exploited the Mongols' logistical weaknesses, launching constant raids and harassing their supply lines. All resources, from food stores to treasures, were moved deep into the mountains, out of the enemy's reach. Villagers destroyed crops, livestock, and anything that might sustain the Mongol forces. Over time, hunger and disease began to erode the invaders' strength. Champa's harsh climate proved to be another formidable enemy for the Mongols. Unlike Dai Viet, where the terrain offered some reprieve, Champa's environment was relentless. The intense heat, monsoon rains, and unfamiliar diseases further demoralized and decimated the invaders. Each passing day in this foreign land drained the Mongols' resolve. Starved and exhausted, the Mongol forces began to crumble. Soldiers deserted in droves, and those who remained were too weak to sustain the campaign. By the spring of 1284, Sogetu forced to abandon Quainan. He ordered his troops to retreat northward, sailing along the coast until they reached Dai Lang Lake in Indrapura, modern-day Thua Thien Hu. There, the Mongol forces hastily constructed wooden fortifications and established self-sustaining outposts, preparing for what seemed an increasingly hopeless situation. Meanwhile, the Yuan Empire itself was stretched thin. Heavy taxes and forced labor to fund Kublai Khan's expansive military campaigns had sparked rebellions across the realm, diverting resources and troops. This domestic turmoil disrupted the flow of reinforcements to Champa. The Yuan Emperor's attempt to secure a pathway through Dai Viet to launch a southern assault was skillfully rebuffed by the Tran dynasty, leaving Sogetu stranded. When the Mongol reinforcement finally arrived, 30,000 men and hundreds of ships in April 1284, they found Quainan abandoned. A fruitless pursuit of Sugiru northward led the fleet into the jaws of a violent storm, scattering the armada and leaving the survivors demoralized. Refusing to return empty-handed, the Yuan court ordered the remaining forces back to Champa. Yet by then the troops, worn out by the treacherous southern waters, resorted to mutiny and banditry. By now, Sugetu's ambitions of conquering Champa were thoroughly dashed. His forces, isolated and self-reliant, could only fortify their positions. Meanwhile, the Cham king and crown prince refrained from direct assaults, instead negotiating for Sugetu's withdrawal. Deprived of reinforcements and leadership cohesion, the Yuan forces lost their edge. King Indravarman diplomatically played for time, offering symbolic tributes to pacify the Yuan court while secretly mobilizing resistance. His envoys presented a map of Champa to Kublai Khan, promising loyalty if the Mongols withdrew, a tactic to buy breathing room while the invaders succumbed to tropical diseases and unfamiliar terrain. If the Cham people had failed to stop the Mongol forces from becoming part of the Yuan-Mongol Empire, Sugetu's army would have joined forces with Isan Timur's faction in pagan modern-day Myanmar, leaving Dai Viet helplessly encircled. Even without direct conflict, the country would have been swallowed up.